How did white plantation mistresses use sex as a weapon of power, maintaining both white supremacy and patriarchy? The slaves faced harsh punishments for minor mistakes, and basic humanity was absent from their lives. What adds a haunting layer to this historical tale is how the plantation owners' lusty fantasies would be satiated using the private parts of the slaves. In this video, we reveal a side of history surrounding the nasty truth about these mistresses' sex lives. Before we dive into the intriguing stories ahead, make sure you're part of our community. Smash that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Discover more about the strange and personal lives of the white plantation mistresses. The lady owner of the plantation held a position of great importance, just behind the chief owner. She supervised the work of all the slaves on the plantation. She used her power to take advantage of the slaves in many ways. Female slaves were subjected to whipping, and frequently had to spend long hours standing in the hot heat in the fields for small mistakes. Former slave and author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacob, provides first-hand accounts of life on the estates. The slave girl was raised in an environment of licentiousness and terror. She had no choice but to learn dirty jokes and foul language from her owner and his sons. Her owner, his sons, the overseer, or maybe all of them, started bribing her with gifts when she was 14 or 15. If these were ineffective, they would lash and starve her until she submitted to their will. What particular circumstances set the stage for sexual relations between planter-class women and slave men? The private world of the wives of wealthy planters was often filled with dissatisfaction. Mistresses were unhappy since they were also in a state of slavery and were expected to be happy and submissive. Their husbands had many affairs with black slaves, leading to the birth of children. This situation left the mistresses trapped and disgusted. The boredom increased, making their misery worse when their husbands went on trips. Out of boredom, they chose to exploit slaves in various ways, including satisfying their lustful cravings. Some mistresses were frustrated in their personal lives, so they turned to slaves to accomplish what they wanted. Housewives got married when they were 15 or 16 years old, and as they grew older, they became more and more lonely and sad. Mistresses' affairs with slaves were far less common than those between female slaves and their husbands. The white mistresses and dark-skinned slaves did have intimate relationships, although little is known about them. These relationships developed from the women's inability to control their sexuality when their husbands were away. They were depressed and lonely, and they needed someone to satisfy their burning desires. They enjoyed the extramarital pleasure that their husbands engaged in, adding a touch of spice to their own stories. What was the biggest problem when getting close to black slaves? The biggest risk was the chance of having mixed-race children, and they were well aware of this. In the past, dark-skinned slave men had intimate relationships with white mistresses. This intersectional approach explains how different and sometimes contradictory forms of power and oppression are related to one another. It demonstrates how a person can have a higher status in one part of society while having a lower status in another. In the pages of history, black slaves were handed a bitter pill to swallow, often forced into intimate relationships by their mistress. Captain Richard Hinton mentioned this as well. Richard Hinton wrote that he had never met a man of color who had not related stories of being forced to have sex with either his mistress or with white women of the same social class. Harriet Jacob also discussed how the mistresses took advantage of the intimacy of black slaves. The women slaves had to follow their father's rules in everything, and sometimes they had the same control over the men slaves. There was a case in a household where the owner was deeply embarrassed. His daughter had chosen one of the least respected slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. Why did she not approach her equals or her father's smarter servants? She chose someone who was most oppressed, and she could use her authority with less fear of exposure. There was not the slightest trace of white women's chastity, which Jacobs confirmed and was talked about extensively. The justification for taking advantage of the closeness of dark-skinned slaves was centered on the superiority of white women over black women. This superiority was associated with their chastity, which in turn was linked to controversial and covert sexual acts. Upper-class women saw themselves as superior to black women. They granted themselves permission to satiate their personal desires in this way. Some housewives, frustrated by their husband's absence and a repressive culture, turned to slaves for intimacy. It even happened that they became pregnant and then made great efforts to hide the pregnancy. Mistresses sought a kind of authority in their relationships with slaves that was lacking in their marriage. Scandals that resulted in public humiliation and condemnation from society were rare, although occasionally they were unavoidable. In his autobiography, Charles Paul described the mixed-race children that resulted from the love connections between mistresses and slaves. He had a relationship with the daughter of a wealthy plantation owner. After giving birth, she was not permitted to care for her child. Instead, it was taken away, leading to societal degradation. Her child's sale into slavery wasn't just a choice. It was a desperate move to shield a family secret from scandal on the plantation. This time witnessed instances of infanticide, while others faced the terrible fate of becoming slaves. The wives of plantation owners were supposed to be models of virtue and devotion to their husbands. But why were these women so frustrated? Husbands treating their wives like slaves would irritate their wives, which is understandable, right? Where did that frustration end up? It was often directed at slaves. Women's freedom was strictly restricted. They needed a male escort while traveling. The southern states, particularly in the Low area, have slave codes that demonstrate how the colony's legislatures clearly recognized female mastery from the very beginning. These women independently ran sizable plantations and freely bought, sold, inherited, and employed slaves. This financial status allowed them influential public roles. Affluent married women were given slaves as gifts. Even though they were technically their husband's property, some mistresses did not treat the slaves owned by their husbands the same way they did their own. Former slave Silas Glenn recalled that his mistress was kind to slaves inherited from her father, but cruel to those who came from her husband's family. Many firmly opposed their husbands' attempts at managing, disciplining, or selling their enslaved property. White women, who were raised in homes where they held authority over slaves, absorbed the role of slaveholders. They willingly accepted the rights and responsibilities that went along with it. They boldly asserted their independent ownership within their marriage. For instance, there were women who sold well-trained slaves at high prices, showcasing themselves as skilled businesswomen, true mistresses of the market. These women defied expectations. They researched slave prices and took advantage of shifts in the market. In contrast to popular opinion, they either attended auctions themselves or employed agents to handle such matters on their behalf. Although the sources do not suggest that mistresses became kind allies after seeing the sexual abuse of female slaves, the exact opposite happened. Most of them turned a blind eye, or worse, abused the victims further. They were unable to stop men's misdeeds and were suppressed by the fake notions of female purity imposed upon them. A few acknowledged that slavery was terrible, and simultaneously referred to female slaves who had sexual disorders as prostitutes in the same breath. Some mistresses self-pityingly depicted themselves as the victims of white men's acts, instead of demonstrating compassion for the enslaved victims. Many mistresses reinforced racial stereotypes by portraying black women as hypersexual, animalistic, and complicit in their own abuse. Some mistresses on smaller estates, where they were often confronted with proof of their husband's infidelity, directed their anger towards the victims. Mistresses were not immune from cruel acts. They often beat naked slaves. They would order slaves to massage or perform other intimate acts on their bodies to do, then threatening to falsely accuse enslaved males of rape, securing silence afterwards. In conclusion, narratives have long been formed by the antiquated and traditional belief that men cannot be rape victims. Additionally, there is the persistent idea that women are too emotionally and physically frail to commit serious crimes, including sexual assault. This video makes it more and more clear that women, including white mistresses, are capable of sexual offenses, and that they can use sex as a tool for dominance and control. The documentation of white women forcing black slaves into sexual acts erases popular myths and throws light on a complicated but frequently ignored facet of history. How important is it, in your opinion, to clear up long-standing myths regarding gender roles and criminal activity? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. Please subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, and show some love by tapping the like button.